We don't need your advice anymore, Rebecca. We're adults now. My brother Marcus's words still echo in my mind 2 years later, spoken across my own dining table during what would be our last Easter dinner together. The irony is almost poetic. They didn't want my legal advice then, but they certainly needed my lawyer's expertise when the FBI knocked on their door 6 months later. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rebecca Chen, and I'm a 52-year-old federal prosecutor who spent 25 years clawing my way to the top of one of the most competitive legal environments in the country. I didn't get here by accident or through connections. I earned every single promotion, every case victory, every ounce of respect through sheer determination and an obsession with justice that bordered on religious fervor. Growing up as the eldest of 3 children in a middle-class family in suburban Denver, I was always the responsible one. While my brother Marcus and sister Diane played and socialized, I studied. While they dated and partied through college, I graduated summa cum laude from law school and immediately dove into the deep end of federal prosecution. Our parents, Robert and Linda Chen, had immigrated from Taiwan with nothing but ambition and the unshakable belief that education was the pathway to American success. They worked double shifts at their small restaurant to put all 3 of us through college, and I was determined to make their sacrifices worthwhile. Marcus, 2 years younger than me, had always been the charming one. Handsome, charismatic, and blessed with the kind of easy confidence that opened doors without effort. He married his college sweetheart, Jennifer, and they settled into a comfortable life in Phoenix, where Marcus built what appeared to be a thriving real estate development company. Their twin boys, Nathan and Tyler, were the apple of everyone's eye, especially our parents, who relocated to Phoenix after retirement to be closer to their grandchildren. Diane, the baby of the family at 46, had followed a more artistic path. She was a talented graphic designer who freelanced for various clients while living in a converted loft in Portland. Never married, fiercely independent, she prided herself on being the free spirit of the family. She often joked that while I prosecuted criminals and Marcus built buildings, she created beauty in the world. For years, our family dynamic worked well. I was the successful career woman in Washington, D.C., respected in my field but often too busy for lengthy family visits. Marcus was the family man, the one who hosted holidays and kept everyone connected. Diane was the creative soul who added color and laughter to our gatherings. Our parents were proud of all 3 of their children, each successful in their own way. But success, as I've learned, can be a thin veneer covering deeper problems. The first crack in our family foundation appeared 3 years ago during Thanksgiving. Marcus had been unusually quiet during dinner, and I noticed Jennifer seemed stressed, constantly checking her phone and speaking in hushed tones when she thought no one was listening. As a prosecutor, you develop an instinct for when people are hiding something. The way Marcus avoided eye contact when discussing business, the vague answers about current projects, the expensive new car in the driveway that seemed inconsistent with his claims of a slow market. After dinner, I pulled Marcus aside in his home office, surrounded by architectural drawings and development proposals that looked impressive but somehow felt hollow. "Everything okay with the business?" I asked casually, though my trained eye had already spotted several red flags. The permits posted on his wall for projects that seemed unusually large for his company size. The timeline gaps between projects didn't make sense. Most concerning were the partnership documents I glimpsed that showed investors I recognized as problematic figures from cases I'd worked on. Marcus bristled immediately. "Everything's fine, Becca. Not everyone needs to analyze every detail like you do. Some of us know how to trust people and build relationships without treating everyone like a potential criminal." The defensive tone was telling. In my experience, innocent people didn't respond to casual questions with hostility. But I backed off. He was my brother, and family dynamics are different from professional ones. I told myself that my prosecutor instincts were making me paranoid, that I was seeing problems where none existed. Over the next year, the signs became harder to ignore. Marcus's lifestyle continued escalating. The family moved to a mansion in Scottsdale with a price tag that seemed impossible on legitimate real estate development income, especially in a market he claimed was struggling. Jennifer started wearing jewelry that cost more than most people's annual salaries. The twins were enrolled in an elite private school with tuition that exceeded many college costs. Meanwhile, Marcus became increasingly secretive about his business dealings. Family conversations that used to include detailed discussions about his projects became vague mentions of big deals and confidential opportunities. When pressed for details, he would deflect with jokes or change the subject entirely. The second major red flag came during a summer barbecue at their new house. I was using the bathroom when I overheard Marcus on a phone call in his adjacent home office. The door was slightly ajar and his voice carried clearly. No, you don't understand. The investors are asking questions I can't answer. We need more time to move the funds around before the audit. Can you stall them for another month?" There was a pause, then, "Look, I know it's risky, but we've come too far to back out now. Just keep feeding them the progress reports. By the time they figure out the Phoenix project doesn't exist, we'll have enough from the Miami deal to cover the shortfall." My blood ran cold. This wasn't business struggles or cash flow issues. This was fraud, plain and simple. Marcus was running some kind of Ponzi scheme, using investor money from one fake project to pay returns on another. As a federal prosecutor specializing in white-collar crime, I'd seen this pattern dozens of times. It always ended the same way, with handcuffs and lengthy prison sentences. I stood frozen in the bathroom, my mind racing through the implications. My brother, my charming, charismatic brother, who had always seemed to live a charmed life, was a criminal. Not just any criminal, but the kind of sophisticated financial fraudster I'd spent my career putting behind bars. The ethical dilemma was crushing. As a prosecutor, I had a duty to report financial crimes. As a sister, I had a loyalty to family. As someone who loved Marcus despite his flaws, I wanted to find a way to help him before it was too late. I decided to try the direct approach. That evening, after the other guests had left and the twins were in bed, I asked Marcus to take a walk with me around the neighborhood. The Arizona sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, and the expensive houses around us seemed to mock the conversation I was about to have. "Marcus," I began carefully, "I think you might be in some legal trouble, and I want to help you before it's too late." His face immediately hardened. "What are you talking about?" "I overheard part of your phone conversation earlier about investors, audits, Phoenix projects that don't exist." "Marcus, what you described sounds like securities fraud, potentially mail and wire fraud as well. These are federal crimes with serious consequences." He stopped walking and turned to face me, his expression a mixture of anger and fear. "You were listening to my private conversations? What kind of sister does that? The kind who's trying to keep you out of federal prison. Marcus, if you're running the kind of scheme I think you are, you need to stop now. You need to hire a criminal defense attorney, and you need to consider voluntary disclosure to minimize the charges." "Voluntary disclosure?" He laughed bitterly. "You mean turn myself in? Destroy my family, my business, my life, because my paranoid prosecutor sister thinks she heard something suspicious? I'm trying to save your life, not destroy it. If you cooperate early, if you help recover investor funds, the sentences are much lighter. You could be looking at probation, community service, maybe a few years instead of decades." Marcus shook his head violently. "There's nothing to cooperate about because there's no crime. You're so used to seeing criminals everywhere that you can't even trust your own brother. Maybe if you had a family of your own, you'd understand what it means to build something instead of just tearing things down." The personal attack stung, but I pressed on. "Marcus, I've prosecuted hundreds of cases like this. The pattern is always the same. It starts with borrowing from one investor to pay another. Then it escalates to fake projects, forged documents, increasingly elaborate lies. It always collapses, and when it does, everyone gets hurt. The investors lose their life savings, the perpetrator goes to prison, and the family gets destroyed." "Stop," he said firmly. "Just stop. I don't need your advice, Becca. I don't need you analyzing my business or my life like I'm one of your cases. I'm doing fine without your help." We walked back to the house in tense silence. I spent the rest of the visit watching Marcus and Jennifer interact with their children, wondering how many more family dinners we'd have before everything fell apart. That was when I made my first mistake. I backed off. I told myself that maybe I was wrong. Maybe I'd misunderstood the phone conversation. Maybe Marcus really did have legitimate business deals that just sounded suspicious to my prosecutor-trained ears. I wanted to believe that my brother wasn't a criminal, so I chose to give him the benefit of the doubt. But the doubt gnawed at me. Over the following months, I found myself researching Marcus's business online, looking at property records, checking business filings. What I found was disturbing. Several of the developments he claimed to be working on had no valid permits. Properties listed as under construction on investor reports were vacant lots. Partnership agreements referenced companies that didn't exist. The evidence was mounting, but I still hesitated to act on it. The conflict between my professional obligations and family loyalty was tearing me apart. I'd built my career on the principle that justice was blind, that no one was above the law, but applying that principle to my own brother felt impossible. The breaking point came 6 months before that fateful Easter dinner. I was at a federal law enforcement conference in Las Vegas when I ran into Agent Sarah Mitchell from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. We'd worked together on several cases over the years, and she was one of the most thorough investigators I knew. During a break between sessions, she pulled me aside. "Rebecca, I need to ask you about something, and this conversation needs to stay between us for now." My stomach dropped. "What is it?" "We've been investigating a multi-state investment fraud scheme."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Phoenix-based real estate developer taking money from investors for projects that don't exist. The name that keeps coming up is Marcus Chen. Any relation? The question I'd been dreading for months had finally arrived. I could lie, claim no knowledge, protect my brother, and potentially obstruct a federal investigation. Or I could tell the truth and watch my family implode. "He's my brother," I said quietly. Sarah's expression was sympathetic but professional. I figured, "Look, Rebecca, I know this puts you in an impossible position, but we're going to move forward with the investigation regardless. If you have any information that could help, or if you want to try to convince him to cooperate voluntarily, now would be the time." "How bad is it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Bad. "We're tracking at least 50 investors across 4 states. The fraudulent investment total is approaching $8 million. If we can prove wire fraud across state lines, he's looking at 20 years minimum." $8 million. 50 investors. 20 years in prison. I spent the rest of the conference in a haze, barely registering the presentations and panels. My brother wasn't just running a small-scale scam to maintain his lifestyle. He was the center of a major federal investigation that would destroy not just his life, but the lives of dozens of innocent people who had trusted him with their life savings. When I returned to Washington, I made a decision that would change everything. I called Marcus. "I need to see you," I said without preamble when he answered. "It's urgent." "Becca, is everything okay? You sound strange. Can you come to D.C., or do you want me to fly out there?" There was a pause. "What's this about?" "I can't discuss it over the phone. Marcus, this is serious, more serious than anything we've ever dealt with as a family. I need to see you face to face." Another pause, longer this time. "I can't travel right now. Business is crazy. Can it wait until Easter? We're all going to be at Mom and Dad's anyway." Easter. Still months away. By then, the FBI investigation would be much further along. By then, it might be too late for voluntary cooperation to make any difference. "Marcus, I strongly recommend you make time for this conversation before Easter. What I need to discuss with you is time-sensitive." "Becca, you're scaring me. Just tell me what's wrong." I closed my eyes, knowing that my next words would either save my brother or end our relationship forever. "The FBI is investigating your business. They know about the fake properties, the phantom investors, the money transfers between accounts. They know everything, Marcus, and they're coming for you."
The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I wondered if he'd hung up. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do you know that?" "Because I'm a federal prosecutor, and Agent Mitchell is a colleague of mine. She asked me directly if Marcus Chen was related to me. The investigation is real, it's serious, and it's moving forward whether you cooperate or not." "You told them I was your brother?" "I told them the truth. Marcus, lying to federal agents is another felony. I'm trying to help you navigate this before it gets worse." "Before it gets worse?" His voice was rising now, panic replacing the whisper. "How could it get worse than my own sister participating in a federal investigation against me?" I'm not participating in anything. I recused myself the moment Sarah mentioned your name.
But Marcus, this investigation exists with or without me. Your choice is simple. Cooperate now while you still have leverage, or wait for them to arrest you when they have an airtight case. I need to think about this. Don't think too long. And Marcus, don't do anything stupid like trying to hide assets or destroy documents. That will only make the charges worse. He hung up without saying goodbye. For weeks afterward, I heard nothing. No returned calls, no texts, no communication through our parents. I began to wonder if I'd made the right choice in warning him, or if I should have simply recused myself and let the investigation proceed without interfering. The answer came in February, 2 months before Easter, when Sarah Mitchell called me again. Rebecca, we've got a problem with your brother's case. What kind of problem? The kind where the suspect has been systematically destroying evidence and moving assets offshore. Someone warned him we were coming, and now our case is significantly more complicated. My heart sank. Marcus hadn't used my warning to seek legal counsel or consider cooperation. He'd used it to cover his tracks and make himself look even more guilty. Any idea who might have tipped him off? Sarah asked, though we both knew the answer. I'd told him about the investigation, I admitted. I thought if he knew you were closing in, he might be willing to cooperate voluntarily. Jesus, Rebecca. I know he's your brother, but you just compromised a federal investigation. The weight of what I'd done hit me like a physical blow. In trying to save Marcus, I'd helped him obstruct justice. I'd potentially made it harder for the FBI to recover the stolen money and get justice for the victims. I'd violated every principle I'd spent my career defending. Sarah, I know I screwed up. Is there anything I can do to help fix this? Stay away from the case entirely. Don't talk to your brother. Don't try to influence him. Don't give him any more information about the investigation. And, Rebecca, you might want to consider hiring your own attorney. Interfering with a federal investigation, even with good intentions, can have serious consequences. The call ended, and I sat in my office staring out at the Washington skyline, wondering how I'd gone from respected prosecutor to potential federal defendant in the span of a single phone call. That's when I made my second crucial decision. If Marcus wouldn't listen to me as his sister, maybe he'd listen to me as a federal prosecutor who knew exactly how these cases ended. If he wouldn't accept help voluntarily, maybe he needed to understand the full consequences of his choices before it was too late. I decided to make one last attempt at the family Easter gathering, not as someone trying to interfere with an investigation, but as someone trying to save what was left of our family before the FBI destroyed it entirely. I spent weeks preparing for that conversation, crafting arguments that might penetrate Marcus's denial and desperation. I researched sentencing guidelines, plea bargain precedents, and cooperation agreements. I prepared a comprehensive explanation of exactly what he was facing and what his options were. But I also prepared for the possibility that he would reject my help entirely. That's when I made arrangements with my own attorney, David Reeves, to handle the potential fallout from my earlier interference in the investigation. I also did something else, something that would prove crucial in the months to come. I hired a private investigator to document Marcus's ongoing financial activities. If he was going to continue destroying evidence and hiding assets, I wanted an independent record of his actions, not to help the FBI, but to protect myself from any claims that I was continuing to interfere with their investigation. What my private investigator uncovered was worse than I had imagined. Marcus wasn't just hiding money from the FBI. He was actively stealing more. Even knowing that federal agents were watching him, even understanding that his schemes were unraveling, he was continuing to solicit new investors. He was using my warning not as an opportunity to come clean, but as intelligence to help him commit more sophisticated crimes. The reports showed new shell companies being formed in Nevada and Delaware, bank accounts opened in the Cayman Islands, property transfers to Jennifer's relatives that looked suspiciously like asset hiding, and most damning of all, new investor contracts being signed for developments that Marcus knew would never be built. By the time Easter arrived, I had evidence that my brother wasn't just a financial criminal. He was a sociopath who was willing to destroy more lives to save himself, even after being explicitly warned about the consequences. That Easter dinner was held at my parents' modest home in Phoenix, the same house they'd bought when they retired to be closer to Marcus's family. The contrast between their simple, honest lifestyle and Marcus's stolen luxury was strike. Mom had spent days preparing traditional Chinese dishes alongside American holiday classics, creating a fusion feast that represented our family's immigrant journey. Diane had flown in from Portland, full of stories about her latest art projects and the creative community she had built around herself. She seemed genuinely happy, fulfilled by work that mattered to her, even if it didn't generate the wealth that Marcus and I had achieved. Marcus and Jennifer arrived with the twins, who had grown into handsome, polite boys who clearly adored their father. They had no idea that their comfortable life was built on theft, or that their father was facing decades in federal prison. Watching Marcus interact with his children, seeing the genuine love and pride in his eyes, made what I had to do even more painful. The early part of the dinner was pleasant, filled with the kind of family conversation that had sustained us for decades. Mom fussed over everyone's plates, making sure we all ate enough.
Dad told stories about the restaurant's regular customers and the neighborhood changes he'd witnessed over the years. Diane showed us photos of her latest gallery showing, beaming with artistic pride. But I could see the strain beneath Marcus's performance. He was laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't particularly funny. He kept checking his phone despite Jennifer's disapproving looks. Most tellingly, he avoided making direct eye contact with me throughout the meal, something that would have been imperceptible to anyone who hadn't known him since childhood. After dinner, while the twins played video games and the adults relaxed with coffee and dessert, I decided it was time for the conversation I'd been dreading and planning for months. "Marcus," I said carefully, "could I speak with you privately for a few minutes?" The tension in the room was immediate and palpable. Jennifer's face went pale. Diane looked confused but concerned. My parents exchanged worried glances. "Can't it wait, Becca?" Marcus said with forced lightness. "It's Easter, family time. Let's not ruin the holiday with work talk." I wish it could wait, but it can't. This affects everyone in this room, and everyone deserves to know what's coming. Marcus's facade finally cracked. "What's coming? What are you talking about?" I looked around the room at the faces of my family, people I loved who were about to have their world destroyed by what I was about to reveal. But they deserved the truth. They deserved time to prepare for what was going to happen, whether I spoke up or not. Marcus is under federal investigation for securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. The FBI has evidence of an $8 million investment scheme involving fake real estate developments across multiple states. The investigation is active, ongoing, and will likely result in federal charges within the next few months. The silence that followed was deafening. Jennifer was the first to speak. "That's impossible. Marcus builds real properties. We have contracts, permits, investor reports. This is just some misunderstanding that can be cleared up." "No, Jennifer, it's not a misunderstanding. The properties listed in the investor reports don't exist. The permits are for projects that were never started. The money from early investors has been used to pay fake returns to later investors while funding a lifestyle that's completely inconsistent with legitimate business income." Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Stop. Just stop right there, Rebecca. I don't know what kind of sick game you're playing, but I won't let you destroy my family with these lies." "They're not lies, Marcus, and you know it. I've seen the evidence. I know about the Cayman accounts, the shell companies, the fake progress reports. I know about the new investors you've been signing even after I warned you about the investigation." His face went white. "How could you possibly know about that?" Because unlike you, I understand how federal investigations work. Because I've been documenting your activities to protect myself from your increasingly criminal behavior, and because I'm a prosecutor who recognizes evidence when I see it. Marcus turned to face the rest of the family, desperation replacing anger. She's lying. Rebecca has always been jealous of my success, of my family, of my life. She can't stand that I built something real while she spent her life prosecuting people. This is just her way of trying to tear me down. Then explain the bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, I said calmly. Explain the shell companies registered 3 weeks ago. Explain how you've maintained a $1 million lifestyle on a business that hasn't completed a legitimate project in 2 years. Marcus looked like a cornered animal, dangerous and unpredictable. Even if that were true, even if there were some irregularities in my business practices, what gives you the right to destroy your own brother? What gives you the right to side with the government against your own family? I'm not siding with anyone. I'm trying to save what's left of this family before you destroy it completely. Marcus, if you cooperate now, if you help recover the investor money, if you show genuine remorse and accountability, you might be able to get a sentence that allows you to have some kind of relationship with your children. If you continue down this path, if you keep stealing and lying and hiding assets, you're going to die in federal prison. That's when Diane spoke up, her voice shaky but determined. What exactly are you asking him to do, Rebecca? I looked at my sister, this talented, independent woman who had always stayed out of family drama, who valued peace and harmony above almost everything else. What I was about to say would force her to choose sides in a battle that would define our family's future. I'm asking him to hire a criminal defense attorney immediately.
To stop all business activities, to preserve all documents and records, and to seriously consider voluntary cooperation with federal authorities to minimize the damage to everyone involved. Marcus laughed bitterly. Voluntary cooperation. You mean confess to crimes, implicate other people, ruin more lives just to save myself a few years in prison? I mean, take responsibility for what you've done and try to make it right while you still can. Jennifer, who had been silent since my initial revelation, suddenly stood up. "Boys," she called to her sons in the living room, "get your things together. We're leaving." "Jennifer, wait," I said. "You need to understand what's happening here. You need to protect yourself and your children." She turned on me with a fury I'd never seen from her before. Protect them from what? From their father? From their family? The only thing I need to protect them from is you, Rebecca. You and your paranoid accusations and your need to destroy everything good in our lives. "Mom," I said, turning to my parents who had been sitting in stunned silence. "Dad, you need to know that this investigation will likely result in asset forfeiture. Any gifts Marcus has given you, any money he's transferred, any property he's put in your names, the government will try to recover as proceeds of crime." My father spoke for the first time since my revelation, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Rebecca, how can you do this to your own brother? How can you choose strangers over family?" The question hit me like a physical blow. This man, who had worked 18-hour days to put me through law school, who had sacrificed everything to give his children opportunities he'd never had, was questioning my loyalty because I was trying to prevent his son from destroying more lives? "Dad, I'm not choosing strangers over family. I'm trying to save our family from complete destruction. When the FBI arrests Marcus, and they will arrest him, it's going to be national news. The victims are going to sue for every asset they can find. The legal fees alone will bankrupt everyone connected to this." Marcus gathered his composure enough to deliver what he clearly thought would be the final blow to my argument. "You want to know the truth, Becca? The truth is that I don't need your advice anymore. None of us do. You've spent so many years prosecuting people that you can't see the difference between criminals and family. You've become so obsessed with your precious justice system that you're willing to sacrifice your own brother to it? He looked around the room, making eye contact with each family member except me. We're adults, Rebecca. We can handle our own problems without your interference. We don't need your legal advice. We don't need your warnings. And we don't need your protection. What we need is for you to trust us and support us instead of treating us like criminals. Diane nodded reluctantly. Marcus is right, Rebecca. Maybe you should let him handle his own business affairs. You can't control everything. Even my parents seemed to be siding with Marcus. Mom reached over to pat his hand supportively. Rebecca, dear, maybe you're being too suspicious. Marcus has always been a good boy, a good father, a good provider. Surely there's some explanation for whatever the FBI thinks they found. I looked around the room at my family, people I'd loved and protected and supported for decades, and realized that they were choosing comfortable lies over difficult truths. They were choosing to believe Marcus's denials over my evidence because accepting the reality would require them to acknowledge that their lives were about to be destroyed. Fine, I said, standing up and gathering my purse. You don't want my advice, you don't need my help, then handle this yourselves. But when the FBI shows up with arrest warrants and asset forfeiture orders, don't call me. When the victims start filing civil suits and the media starts covering the story, don't expect me to clean up the mess. You're adults, like you said. You can deal with the consequences of your choices. Marcus's expression was triumphant. That's right, we can, and we will, without your interference. As I walked toward the door, I turned back one last time. Marcus, I hope I'm wrong about all of this. I hope you found a way to run a legitimate business that I just don't understand. I hope the FBI investigation turns up nothing, and I hope your investors get every penny they were promised. But if I'm right, if this plays out the way I think it will, remember this conversation. Remember that I tried to help you while there was still time. I left my parents' house that Easter Sunday knowing it would likely be the last time our family would be together in the same room as free people.
The months that followed were a strange combination of vindication and heartbreak. I went back to my work in Washington, throwing myself into cases with renewed intensity, trying to distract myself from the impending explosion I knew was coming in Phoenix. My private investigator continued documenting Marcus's activities, and the reports grew increasingly disturbing. Rather than scaling back his operations, Marcus seemed to be accelerating them. New investors were being recruited with increasingly outrageous promises of returns. The fake projects were becoming more elaborate, with professional-looking websites and staged construction photos. Most troubling of all, Marcus was using our family's reputation to lend credibility to his schemes. Investor materials now prominently featured the fact that his sister was a, quote, respected federal prosecutor, implying that his business dealings had been vetted by someone with law enforcement credentials. When I learned about this final betrayal, I called David Reeves, my attorney. They're using my name and reputation to defraud more victims, I told him. This has gone beyond family loyalty into something much darker. David's advice was clear and unambiguous. Rebecca, you need to document this immediately. If investors are being told that a federal prosecutor has endorsed these deals, that's not just securities fraud anymore. That's fraud using false government endorsement. The sentences for that are much more severe. What should I do? You should consider proactive cooperation with the FBI investigation. If Marcus is using your name to commit federal crimes, you're potentially a victim as well as a witness. But more importantly, every day he continues this fraud, more people lose their life savings. Your obligation as a prosecutor and as a human being is to help stop it. So I made the call that would define the next chapter of our family story. I contacted Agent Mitchell and offered to cooperate fully with the investigation, not as Marcus's sister, but as a law enforcement professional whose name and reputation were being used to commit crimes. The meeting took place in a sterile conference room at the FBI's Phoenix field office. Present were Agent Mitchell, 2 other FBI investigators, and an assistant U.S. attorney I'd worked with on previous cases. I brought boxes of documents my private investigator had compiled, financial records that showed the scope and sophistication of Marcus's schemes. "Rebecca," Agent Mitchell began, "we appreciate your willingness to cooperate, but I need to make sure you understand the implications of what you're doing here. I understand that my brother is using my name and professional reputation to steal money from innocent people, and that every day this continues, more lives are destroyed. I understand that my obligation as a prosecutor is to prevent crime, not enable it by staying silent." The assistant U.S. attorney leaned forward. "We're prepared to offer you immunity in exchange for your cooperation, but we need complete honesty about your previous involvement in this case." I told them everything. About the overheard phone call, about my initial warning to Marcus, about my decision to hire a private investigator, about the ongoing use of my name in investment materials. I held nothing back, knowing that any deception would only make things worse. When I finished, Agent Mitchell reviewed the documents I'd provided. "This is incredibly detailed intelligence, Rebecca. With this information, we can move much more quickly to shut down the ongoing fraud and recover assets for the victims. What happens now?" "Now we prepare arrest warrants and asset forfeiture orders. Based on what you've provided, we're looking at federal charges including securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Giving a scope of the scheme and the use of your professional reputation, we're also adding charges related to false government endorsement." I felt a mixture of relief and grief. Relief that the investigation was finally moving toward resolution. Grief that my cooperation would likely send my brother to prison for decades. When will the arrests happen? Soon. Probably within the next few weeks. Rebecca, I want you to know that your cooperation here will likely save more potential victims and help us recover assets that would otherwise be hidden offshore. You're doing the right thing, even though I know it doesn't feel that way. The arrests came on a Tuesday morning in November, exactly 6 months after that Easter dinner. I was in my office in Washington when David Reeves called with the news. They got him. Marcus, Jennifer, and 3 business associates were arrested this morning on federal charges. Asset forfeiture teams are seizing properties, bank accounts, and luxury items. The story is already hitting the news. I turned on the television to see aerial footage of FBI agents leading Marcus away from his Scottsdale mansion in handcuffs. The news crawler at the bottom of the screen read, "Phoenix real estate developer arrested in $12 million fraud scheme." The amount had grown by $4 million in the 6 months since my Easter warning. My phone started ringing immediately. Reporters wanting comments about my brother's arrest, colleagues expressing shock and support, my parents crying and demanding that I fix what I helped break. The hardest call came from Diane. "How could you do this, Rebecca? How could you help them arrest your own brother? Diane, Marcus was using my name to steal money from retirees, veterans, working families trying to secure their financial futures. I couldn't let that continue. But he's family."
We protect family, no matter what. Not when family is destroying innocent people's lives. Not when staying silent makes me complicit in federal crimes. The conversation ended with Diane hanging up on me, and I knew that my relationship with my sister might never recover. Over the following weeks, the scope of Marcus's crimes became fully apparent. The FBI investigation revealed that the fraud had ultimately involved over $12 million from more than 80 victims across 6 states. Some of the victims were retirees who had lost their entire life savings. Others were young families who had invested their children's college funds. Several were military veterans who had trusted Marcus with their disability benefits. The human cost was devastating, and it was detailed in victim impact statements that were filed with the court. Stories of elderly people who now couldn't afford their medications. Families facing foreclosure because they'd invested their savings in Marcus's non-existent developments. Veterans who felt betrayed by someone who had claimed to support military families while stealing their benefits. Reading those statements, I felt a complex mixture of guilt and vindication. Guilt that I hadn't acted sooner to stop Marcus's crimes, Vindication that my cooperation had helped recover assets and prevent even more people from being victimized. The 18 months following Marcus's arrest were the darkest period of my life. While the media painted me as the heroic prosecutor who brought down her own criminal brother, the reality was far more complicated and painful. I had saved strangers while destroying my family, and the weight of that choice crushed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. My relationship with my parents disintegrated completely. They refused to speak to me, convinced that I had orchestrated Marcus's downfall out of jealousy and spite. When I tried to visit them during Marcus's trial, my father met me at the door and told me I was no longer welcome in their home. "You chose the government over your family," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment that cut deeper than any anger could have. "You destroyed your brother's life, your nephew's future, and our family's honor. We have no daughter who would do such a thing." The door closed in my face, and I stood on their porch, crying for the first time since the whole ordeal began. These were the people who had worked themselves to exhaustion to give me opportunities they'd never had. They had supported my education, celebrated my career achievements, and been proud of their successful daughter who worked in service of justice. Now they saw me as a traitor who had used my position to destroy their son. Diane's reaction was equally devastating, though different in its manifestation. She didn't cut me off entirely, but our conversations became stilted and formal. The easy sisterly relationship we'd maintained despite our different life paths was gone, replaced by careful politeness that somehow hurt more than outright hostility would have. "I understand why you felt you had to do what you did," she told me during one painful phone call. "But understanding something intellectually and accepting it emotionally are two different things. Every time I see you, I'm going to think about Marcus in prison and those boys growing up without their father. I don't know if I can get past that." The twins, Nathan and Tyler, were perhaps the most heartbreaking casualties of the entire situation. At 12 years old, they were old enough to understand that their father was in prison, but too young to comprehend the complexity of the crimes he'd committed. In their minds, I was simply the aunt who had put their daddy in jail. Jennifer, facing her own legal troubles as an alleged co-conspirator, had moved back to her parents' home in Ohio with the boys. The house they had lived in was seized as part of the asset forfeiture, along with the cars, jewelry, and other luxury items that had defined their lifestyle. The children went from private school to public school, from a mansion to a modest apartment, from abundance to uncertainty. I tried reaching out to Jennifer multiple times, offering to help with the transition, to provide financial support for the boys' needs, to maintain some kind of relationship with my nephews. Her response was always the same: a formal letter from her attorney stating that any contact from me would be considered harassment and could result in a restraining order. The professional consequences were almost as difficult to navigate. While my cooperation with the FBI investigation was officially commended, the circumstances created an uncomfortable dynamic with my colleagues. Some respected the difficult choice I had made, understanding that my professional obligations had required me to act despite the personal cost. Others whispered about whether someone who would prosecute their own family could be trusted, wondering what I might do to them if our interests ever conflicted. My supervisor, District Attorney Catherine Rodriguez, called me into her office 6 months after Marcus's conviction. "Rebecca, I want you to know that your handling of the Marcus Chen case was exemplary from a professional standpoint. You recognized a conflict of interest, you recused yourself appropriately, and when you became aware that your name was being used to commit crimes, you cooperated fully with the investigation." I waited for the but that I could hear coming in her tone. "But I'm concerned about the impact this situation is having on your work and your well-being. You've been distracted, isolated from colleagues, and frankly, you seem to be carrying a burden of guilt that's affecting your judgment in other cases." I was right. I had thrown myself into work with even greater intensity than usual, taking on complex cases that required 18-hour days and left no time for personal reflection. But the quality of my work was suffering. I was second-guessing decisions that should have been automatic, overthinking strategy to the point of paralysis,
and struggling with the fundamental question of whether justice and family loyalty could ever coexist. "I think you should consider taking some time off," Catherine continued. "Maybe see a counselor who specializes in ethical conflicts in law enforcement. This kind of situation creates trauma that needs to be processed professionally." I resisted the suggestion initially, convinced that I could work through the emotional aftermath the same way I'd worked through every other challenge in my career. But the isolation was becoming unbearable. I was succeeding professionally while failing completely as a human being, respected by strangers while being rejected by everyone I loved. The breaking point came during Marcus's sentencing hearing. As the lead prosecutor who had provided key evidence, I was required to attend, even though I had no official role in the proceedings. Sitting in that federal courtroom, watching my brother in an orange jumpsuit as the judge detailed his crimes and their impact on the victims, I felt a combination of vindication and devastation that threatened to break me entirely. The judge sentenced Marcus to 15 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. It was a substantial sentence, reflecting the severity of his crimes and the number of victims involved, but it was less than the maximum he could have received. His cooperation in recovering some of the stolen assets and his lack of prior criminal history had worked in his favor. When the judge asked Marcus if he had anything to say before sentencing, he stood and delivered a statement that I will never forget. "Your Honor, I take full responsibility for my crimes and the pain I have caused to the victims and their families.
I let greed and fear drive me to make decisions that I knew were wrong, and I compounded those wrongs by continuing the fraud even after I knew I was under investigation." He paused, and I could see him struggling with his emotions. "But I want the court to know that my sister, Linda Chen, had no knowledge of my criminal activities until she was contacted by federal agents. Any suggestion that she was involved in or benefited from my crimes is false. She fulfilled her duty as a prosecutor and as a citizen when she cooperated with this investigation, even though doing so cost her the relationships with family members who blamed her for my arrest." His voice cracked slightly as he continued. "Rebecca tried to warn me, tried to get me to stop before I hurt more people, and I ignored her advice because I was too proud and too scared to face what I'd done. She's not responsible for my being here today. I am. And I want my sons to know, when they're old enough to understand, that their Aunt Rebecca is a person of integrity who chose to do what was right even when it was painful." The statement was unexpected and generous, an acknowledgement of my position that I hadn't anticipated from someone who had every reason to resent me. But it also felt like a goodbye. A final statement from a brother who knew our relationship could never be repaired, regardless of his forgiveness. After the sentencing, I sat in my car in the courthouse parking garage and cried harder than I had since childhood. The case was over. Justice had been served. The victims had some measure of closure and compensation, but I felt emptier than I had ever felt in my life. That evening, I called Dr. Sarah Williamson, a therapist who specialized in ethical conflicts among law enforcement professionals. My first session was scheduled for the following week. Dr. Williamson's office was nothing like the sterile government buildings where I spent my days. Warm lighting, comfortable furniture, and walls lined with books created an atmosphere that invited openness rather than defensive caution. She was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a direct manner that reminded me of my law school mentors. "Tell me about the choice you made," she said during our first session. "Not the professional justification or the legal reasoning. Tell me about the human experience of deciding to cooperate in the prosecution of your brother." The question unleashed emotions I'd been suppressing for months. I talked about the guilt, the sense of betrayal I felt both giving and receiving, the loneliness of being cut off from everyone I'd grown up loving. I described the nightmares where Marcus's children asked me why I'd destroyed their family, and the dreams where my parents welcomed me home only for me to wake up to the reality of their rejection. "Do you believe you made the right choice?" Dr. Williamson asked. "Professionally, yes. Legally, absolutely. Morally, I think so, but emotionally, I don't know if I can live with the consequences." "Tell me about the consequences you're struggling with most." "The loneliness.
I've been alone before. I chose career over family relationships many times over the years. But this is different. This isn't being alone because I was too busy to maintain relationships. This is being alone because I chose strangers over family, justice over loyalty, principle over love. Dr. Williamson leaned forward slightly. Is that really how you see it? You chose strangers over family? I considered the question carefully. I chose protecting future victims over protecting Marcus. I chose stopping ongoing crimes over maintaining family harmony. But yes, I chose the welfare of people I'd never met over the welfare of people I'd loved my entire life. And the people you chose to protect, the victims of Marcus's fraud, were they strangers when you made that choice? Mostly yes. I knew they existed. I'd seen the victim impact statements, but I didn't know them personally. But you knew the type of people they were likely to be based on your experience with financial crime cases. I nodded. Retirees, working families, people who had saved money they couldn't afford to lose and trusted someone who promised to help them build financial security. So you were protecting people who were vulnerable in the same way your parents had been vulnerable when they immigrated to this country with nothing but hope for a better future? The observation hit me like a physical blow. I had never made that connection before, never realized that my choice to protect Marcus's victims was rooted in my understanding of what it meant to be powerless in the face of people who would exploit that powerlessness. Over the following months of therapy, I began to develop a different framework for understanding what had happened to my family. Rather than seeing it as a choice between family loyalty and professional duty, Dr. Williamson helped me recognize it as a choice between two different kinds of love. My love for Marcus was personal, rooted in shared history and biological connection. But my commitment to protecting people from financial predators was also a form of love, a love for the principles that made civilization possible and for the vulnerable people who needed someone to stand up for them. The tragedy isn't that you chose strangers over family, Dr. Williamson explained during one session. The tragedy is that Marcus put you in a position where you had to choose at all. He created a situation where protecting innocent people required destroying your relationship with him. The therapy helped me process the guilt and grief, but it didn't restore my relationships with my family. My parents remained estranged, convinced that I had betrayed the fundamental loyalty that held families together. Diane maintained polite but distant contact, sending Christmas cards and birthday messages, but never truly rebuilding the closeness we'd once shared. Most painfully, I had no relationship at all with Nathan and Tyler. They were growing up without knowing their aunt, forming their understanding of family and justice and right and wrong, without the influence of someone who had tried to balance love and principle in an impossible situation.
As Marcus's sentence progressed and the immediate aftermath of the case faded from public attention, I found myself facing a different kind of challenge. The professional success I worked toward my entire career felt hollow when I had no family to share it with. Promotions and commendations meant nothing when the people whose pride and approval had motivated me for decades no longer spoke to me. I began to realize that I needed to rebuild my life around something other than career achievement and family approval. At 48 years old, I had to discover who Rebecca Chen was when stripped of both professional identity and family connection. The answer came gradually, through volunteer work with organizations that helped elderly victims of financial fraud. Working directly with people who had been victimized by schemes similar to Marcus's gave me a sense of purpose that transcended both career advancement and family relationships. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson was 73 years old when she contacted our victim assistance program. She had lost her life savings, nearly $40,000, to a real estate investment scheme that promised guaranteed returns of 20% annually. The scheme had used promotional materials featuring testimonials from satisfied investors and professional-looking documentation that made it appear legitimate. I should have known it was too good to be true, she told me during our first meeting. But they were so convincing, and I needed that money to last for the rest of my life. My husband died 2 years ago, and Social Security isn't enough to cover my medical expenses. Working with Mrs. Patterson and others like her, I began to understand the human cost of financial fraud in ways that reading victim impact statements had never conveyed. These weren't just numbers in a prosecution report.
They were people whose trust had been weaponized against them, who faced genuine hardship because someone like Marcus had decided their comfort was more important than other people's survival. The work was emotionally demanding, but deeply satisfying. Unlike my prosecutorial work, which focused on punishment after crimes had been committed, victim assistance work focused on healing and recovery. I helped people navigate insurance claims, apply for emergency assistance, and rebuild their financial lives after being devastated by fraud. More importantly, I helped them process the emotional trauma of betrayal. Many fraud victims struggled with shame and self-blame, convinced that they should have been smarter or more suspicious. Working with them helped me understand that trust wasn't a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be protected. 3 years after Marcus's sentencing, I received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was familiar, but older, more mature than I remembered. "Aunt Rebecca? This is Tyler. Tyler Chen, Marcus's son." My heart stopped. Tyler would be 15 now. Nearly finished with high school, old enough to form his own opinions about family and justice and the choices adults make in impossible situations. "Tyler?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm so glad to hear from you. How are you? How is Nathan?" "We're okay. Nathan's doing better than me in school, but I'm better at sports. Mom says we're not supposed to talk to you, but I wanted to understand some things about what happened with Dad." The conversation that followed was one of the most important of my life. Tyler asked direct questions about the timeline of events, about my role in the investigation, about whether there had been any way to save his father without sending him to prison. His questions were intelligent and thoughtful, demonstrating a maturity that came from growing up too quickly in the aftermath of family trauma. "I read some articles about the case online," he said. "I know Dad stole money from people, and I know you helped the FBI catch him, but I don't understand why you couldn't have just told him to give the money back instead of getting him arrested." I explained as gently as I could that by the time I learned about Marcus's crimes, returning the money wasn't possible because it had already been spent or hidden offshore. I described the legal requirement for prosecutors to report federal crimes and the impossibility of handling fraud of that magnitude through private family intervention. "But you could have warned him earlier, right? You could have told him to stop before it got so bad." "I did warn him, Tyler. I told him about the investigation months before his arrest. I begged him to get a lawyer and consider cooperating voluntarily. But instead of stopping, he used my warning to hide evidence and commit more crimes." There was a long silence on the phone. Finally, Tyler asked, "Do you think he's a bad person?" The question pierced my heart. How do you explain to a 15-year-old that someone can be both a loving father and a criminal, both genuinely caring and destructively selfish? "I think your father is someone who made very bad choices when he was scared and desperate. I think he loved you and Nathan more than anything in the world, but he also hurt a lot of innocent people because he couldn't face the consequences of his mistakes." "Do you miss him?" Tyler asked. "Every day," I answered honestly. "He's my little brother, and despite everything that happened, I still love him. I wish things had been different. I wish he had listened to my advice and gotten help before it was too late." "Mom says you destroyed our family because you cared more about your job than about us." The accusation was one I'd heard before, from my parents and from Diane, but hearing it from my nephew felt different. This wasn't an adult choosing sides in a complex ethical conflict. This was a child trying to understand why his family had been torn apart. "Tyler, I understand why your mother feels that way, and I don't blame her for being angry with me. But I need you to know that every choice I made was about trying to prevent more people from being hurt. Your father's crimes were destroying families just like ours."
There were elderly people who lost their retirement savings, military veterans who lost their disability benefits, young families who lost their children's college funds. Someone had to speak up for them. But they were strangers. We were family. Being family doesn't give someone the right to hurt innocent people. And being family means telling the truth, even when it's painful, even when it costs you everything. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering topics that most teenagers never have to think about: the relationship between love and accountability, the difference between loyalty and enabling, the complexity of justice in situations where everyone gets hurt regardless of what choices are made. When we finally said goodbye, Tyler made a request that surprised me. "Aunt Rebecca, would it be okay if I called you again sometime? I have more questions, and Nathan might want to talk to you too. We're going to visit Dad next month, and I want to understand everything before I see him." Permission to maintain contact with my nephews felt like a gift I didn't deserve, but desperately needed. Over the following months, Tyler, and eventually Nathan, began calling regularly. Our conversations weren't always comfortable, and they sometimes included accusations and expressions of anger that I had to absorb without defending myself. But they were honest conversations, grounded in a desire to understand rather than to blame. Through those conversations, I learned about the boys' lives since their father's imprisonment. They had struggled academically and socially, dealing with the stigma of having a father in federal prison and the financial stress of their mother's attempts to rebuild their lives. Jennifer had returned to work as a receptionist, earning a fraction of what their previous lifestyle had cost, and the boys had taken part-time jobs to help with expenses. But they had also developed resilience and empathy that might never have emerged in their previous life of privilege. Nathan had started tutoring younger students who struggled with math, discovering a talent for teaching and a satisfaction in helping others succeed. Tyler had joined his school's debate team, finding that his ability to argue complex ethical questions was both a natural talent and a way to process his own family's complicated history. Most importantly, both boys had maintained their relationship with their father through regular prison visits and phone calls. Marcus had used his time in federal prison to earn his GED, complete a bachelor's degree through correspondence courses, and participate in programs designed to help white-collar criminals understand the impact of their crimes on victims. "Dad's different now," Tyler told me during one of our calls. "He talks about the people he hurt, not just about being caught. He says he wants to spend the rest of his life trying to make up for what he did." These updates about Marcus's transformation in prison created a complicated mixture of hope and regret. Hope that my brother was genuinely becoming the person I'd always believed he could be. Regret that it had taken 15 years in federal prison to catalyze that transformation. 4 years after Marcus's sentencing, I received another unexpected contact. This one came through my attorney, David Reeves, who called to inform me that Marcus was requesting a meeting. He's eligible for family visits now, and he specifically asked if you would come see him. "Rebecca, I want you to think carefully about this. Prison visits can be emotionally challenging under the best circumstances, and given your family's history, this could be particularly difficult." I had avoided visiting Marcus throughout his imprisonment, partly because I wasn't sure I would be welcome, and partly because I wasn't sure I was emotionally prepared for the encounter. But 4 years of therapy and regular contact with his sons had helped me develop a clearer understanding of my own motivations and boundaries. The federal correctional institution where Marcus was serving his sentence was a medium-security facility about 3 hours' drive from Phoenix. The visiting room was sterile but not oppressive, designed to facilitate family contact while maintaining appropriate security. When Marcus walked in wearing standard-issue prison clothing, I was shocked by how much he had changed. The arrogant, desperate man I remembered from his sentencing hearing was gone, replaced by someone who carried himself with quiet dignity. He had lost weight, gained muscle from prison work assignments, and developed a seriousness that had never been present during his years of fraudulent success. "Rebecca," he said, sitting across from me at a small table. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I should," I replied honestly, "but Tyler and Nathan have been asking me to visit you, and I thought it was time." "How are my boys? Really, I mean, not just the version Jennifer gives me during supervised calls." I told him about my recent conversations with his sons, about their academic progress and their part-time jobs and their growing maturity. I described Nathan's tutoring work and Tyler's success on the debate team, making it clear that they were becoming thoughtful, responsible young men despite the trauma of their childhood. They're going to be okay, I concluded. Better than okay. They're developing character and empathy that might not have emerged if their lives had remained comfortable. Marcus nodded, his eyes bright with tears he was trying not to shed. In some ways, I'm grateful that my crimes were discovered when they were. If I'd continued for another few years, if the scheme had grown larger, the damage would have been even worse. Do you really believe that? Or is that just something you tell yourself to make prison bearable? The question was harsher than I had intended, but Marcus didn't flinch from it. Both, I think. Rebecca, I've had 4 years to think about what I did and why I did it. I've participated in victim impact programs where I've met people who were hurt by crimes similar to mine. I've written letters to every person I can identify who lost money because of my fraud, even though most of them will never forgive me and shouldn't. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But I've also had 4 years to think about you and the choice you made and how much courage it must have taken to cooperate with the investigation, knowing it would cost you our family. I didn't feel courageous. I felt like I was betraying you. You were protecting people I was hurting. That's not betrayal. That's integrity. And Rebecca, I need you to know that my statement at sentencing about you having no knowledge of my crimes, that wasn't just legal strategy. That was the truth. And I wanted it on the record because I knew people would try to blame you for my mistakes. We talked for nearly 2 hours, covering topics we should have discussed years earlier.
Marcus described his gradual descent into fraud, explaining how each compromise had made the next one easier until he was too deep to extract himself without facing consequences he couldn't bear. He talked about the therapy and education programs available in prison and his plans for rebuilding his life after release. Most importantly, he apologized. Not just for the crimes he'd committed, but for putting me in a position where protecting innocent people required betraying family loyalty. "I knew you were a prosecutor when I started stealing from investors," he said. "I knew you would eventually find out, and I knew you would have to make an impossible choice between your professional obligations and your love for me. I put you in that position because I was too selfish and too cowardly to stop myself." "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because Tyler and Nathan need to have a relationship with you that isn't poisoned by guilt and resentment. Because our parents need to understand that you saved more families from the kind of destruction we experienced. And because you deserve to know that your choice, however painful it was for all of us, was the right choice." The visit ended with an embrace that felt like both an ending and a beginning. Marcus would serve 11 more years in prison, but he would be released as a man in his 50s with the possibility of rebuilding relationships with his sons and maybe, eventually, with the rest of his family. Driving home from the prison, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the entire ordeal began. Peace. Not happiness, not satisfaction, but a calm acceptance that I had navigated an impossible situation with integrity intact. The healing within my family would be slow and incomplete. My parents remained estranged, unable to reconcile their love for Marcus with their anger toward me. Diane maintained polite but distant contact, sending holiday cards but avoiding deeper emotional territory. Jennifer continued to view me as the architect of her family's destruction and would likely never forgive me for the role I'd played in Marcus's imprisonment. But Tyler and Nathan were building their own relationships with me, independent of their mother's resentment and their grandparents' disappointment. They were old enough now to understand the complexity of adult choices and the sometimes tragic consequences of trying to do what's right in situations where everyone gets hurt. More importantly, I had found a sense of purpose that transcended both professional achievement and family approval. My work with fraud victims continued to be deeply meaningful, providing a way to channel the experience of family betrayal into something constructive and healing. The transformation hadn't restored my family, but it had restored my sense of self.
I was no longer the prosecutor who had betrayed her brother or the daughter who had chosen strangers over family. I was someone who had faced an impossible choice and chosen to protect the vulnerable, even when that choice cost me everything I thought I valued most. That realization would prove crucial when life presented me with the next chapter of the story, one that would test everything I learned about justice, forgiveness, and the true meaning of family. 7 years had passed since that devastating Easter dinner, and I was no longer the same woman who had sat at my parents' table trying to save her family from destruction. At 59, I had evolved from a federal prosecutor defined by career achievement and family approval into something different entirely. A person who understood that true strength comes from surviving the complete loss of everything you thought mattered and discovering what actually does. My transformation hadn't happened overnight or through any single revelation. It had emerged slowly through years of therapy, volunteer work, and the gradual reconstruction of relationships with Tyler and Nathan. I had learned to find meaning in protecting vulnerable people rather than in climbing professional ladders, and I had discovered that family could be chosen rather than simply inherited. The victim advocacy work that had begun as emotional therapy had evolved into something approaching a calling. I had left the federal prosecutor office 2 years earlier to establish the Chen Foundation for Financial Crime Victims, a nonprofit organization that provided legal assistance, financial counseling, and emotional support to people devastated by investment fraud, Ponzi schemes, and elder financial abuse. The foundation operated out of a modest office building in Phoenix, chosen deliberately to be near the community where Marcus's crimes had caused so much damage. Many of our clients were people who had lost money to schemes similar to his, and working with them daily kept me grounded in the human cost of white-collar crime. My personal life had also undergone significant changes. I had purchased a comfortable but unpretentious home in a middle-class Phoenix neighborhood, trading the status symbols of my Washington career for a lifestyle that reflected my values rather than my ambitions. The house had a large kitchen where I cooked meals for friends and colleagues, a home office where I worked on foundation business, and a guest room that Tyler and Nathan used whenever they visited. Both of my nephews had grown into remarkable young men. Tyler, now 22, was finishing his degree in social work at Arizona State University, inspired by his own family's experience with trauma and recovery. Nathan, 21, was studying accounting with plans to specialize in forensic auditing, determined to help prevent the kind of financial crimes his father had committed. Their relationship with me had become one of the most important aspects of my life, providing the family connection I had lost with my parents and siblings, while also offering hope that the next generation could learn from the mistakes of the previous one. Marcus was now in his 9th year in imprisonment, eligible for family visits and work programs that allowed him to contribute meaningfully to prison operations. His letters arrived regularly, filled with updates about his continuing education, his work with victim impact programs, and his plans for post-release life. The angry, defensive man I remembered from his arrest had been replaced by someone who seemed genuinely committed to understanding and atoning for the harm he had caused. My relationship with my parents remained fractured, but no longer completely severed. They had begun sending birthday cards again, stilted communications that acknowledged my existence without embracing reconciliation. Diane maintained similarly distant but cordial contact, sharing updates about her artistic career while avoiding deeper emotional territory. Jennifer's hostility had softened somewhat over the years, particularly as Tyler and Nathan had insisted on maintaining their relationship with me despite her disapproval. She still viewed me as responsible for their family's destruction, but she had stopped actively preventing contact between me and the boys. It was Tyler who first brought news that would reshape our family's dynamics once again. During one of his regular visits to my home, he mentioned that Jennifer was facing serious financial difficulties. Her job as a medical office receptionist barely covered basic living expenses, and she had been struggling to pay Nathan's college tuition while also managing her own mounting medical bills. She's been having chest pains and dizzy spells for months, Tyler explained. his voice heavy with worry. But she keeps putting off seeing a cardiologist because she can't afford the specialist copays. Mom's proud, Aunt Rebecca. She won't ask for help, even when she really needs it. The information created a familiar ethical dilemma, though one very different from the crisis I'd faced years earlier. Jennifer needed help, but she would never accept assistance from me directly. My nephews were worried about their mother's health, but they're college students with no resources to address her medical and financial needs. What kind of help are we talking about? I asked Tyler carefully. She needs about $15,000 to cover the medical tests and procedures the cardiologist is recommending, plus maybe another $10,000 to catch up on bills and give her some breathing room. It's not a fortune, but it might as well be for someone earning what she earns. $25,000 was a substantial sum for most people, but it represented less than 2 months of operating budget for the Chen Foundation. I had accumulated significant savings during my years as a federal prosecutor, and the foundation's success had provided additional financial security. More importantly, I had learned that money's only real value came from its ability to solve problems and relieve suffering. But the situation required careful handling. Jennifer's pride and lingering resentment would make direct financial assistance impossible. She would view any offer of help from me as either charity to be rejected or manipulation to be suspected.
Tyler, would your mother accept help if it came from a different source? If it appeared to be assistance from a medical foundation or a community support program rather than from me personally? His eyes lit up with understanding. You mean create some kind of grant or scholarship that she could apply for without knowing it comes from you? Something like that. But it would have to be completely legitimate, completely above board. I won't create fake programs or mislead anyone about the source of the assistance. Over the following weeks, Tyler, Nathan, and I developed a plan that would provide Jennifer with the medical and financial support she needed while preserving her dignity and autonomy. The Chen Foundation would partner with the local hospital system to create a hardship grant program for single mothers facing medical crises. The program would be real, properly documented, and available to other qualifying applicants, but it would be designed with Jennifer's specific circumstances in mind. The paperwork and legal requirements took several months to establish, but eventually the Arizona Medical Hardship Assistance Program was operational. Jennifer applied based on Tyler's suggestion, was interviewed by foundation staff who didn't know her connection to me, and was approved for a grant that covered her medical expenses and provided temporary financial relief. The process worked exactly as intended. Jennifer received the help she needed without knowing its source, and the foundation established a program that would assist other single mothers facing similar crises. It was a solution that honored both her pride and my desire to help family members who couldn't accept direct assistance. But the medical tests that the grant made possible revealed problems more serious than anyone had anticipated. Jennifer's chest pains weren't caused by stress or anxiety. She had a congenital heart defect that required immediate surgical intervention. Without surgery, the cardiologist explained, she faced significant risk of heart failure within the next few years. The surgery was complex and expensive, far beyond what the initial hardship grant could cover. Jennifer needed specialized cardiac care that would cost well over $100,000, even with insurance coverage. The financial burden was overwhelming, and the emotional stress of facing a life-threatening medical condition while worrying about money was making her health problems worse. Tyler called me in tears after visiting his mother in the hospital following her initial cardiac evaluation. "Aunt Rebecca, I don't know what to do. Mom's scared, really scared, and she keeps talking about what will happen to Nathan and me if something happens to her. The doctors say the surgery needs to happen soon, but she's talking about declining treatment because she can't afford it." The situation had evolved beyond financial assistance into something approaching life-or-death intervention.
Jennifer needed help that only I had the resources to provide, but accepting that help would require her to overcome years of resentment and acknowledge her dependence on someone she viewed as an enemy. Has she talked about the surgery with you and Nathan directly? Does she understand how serious this is? She tries to downplay it when we're around, but I heard her on the phone with the hospital's financial counselor. She was asking about payment plans for the surgery, and when they told her what the monthly payments would be, she just started crying. That evening, I sat in my home office staring at financial documents that represented more than a decade of careful savings and investment. I had enough money to pay for Jennifer's surgery without significantly impacting my own financial security. But writing that check would require her to accept help from the person she blamed for destroying her family. The ethical complexity was different from the situation I had faced with Marcus, but it was no less challenging. Then I had been forced to choose between family loyalty and professional duty, between protecting my brother and protecting his victims. Now I was facing a choice between respecting Jennifer's autonomy and potentially saving her life. I called Dr. Williamson, my therapist, to discuss the situation. Even years after our regular sessions had ended, she remained available for consultation during particularly difficult decisions. Rebecca, what do you think would happen if Jennifer knew the hardship grant came from you? She would probably refuse it. She might even demand that the money be returned rather than accepting what she would see as charity from me. And what do you think would happen if her condition worsens because she can't afford proper treatment? Tyler and Nathan would be devastated. They might lose their mother because of her pride and my inability to find a way to help that she could accept. So you're facing a situation where respecting her autonomy might contribute to an outcome that hurts everyone, including her. Yes, and I'm also facing a situation where helping her without her knowledge feels manipulative, even though the intention is to save her life. Dr. Williamson was quiet for a moment, considering the complexity of the ethical dilemma. Rebecca, you've spent years learning to navigate situations where all available choices have negative consequences. What does your experience tell you about the difference between manipulation for selfish purposes and intervention to prevent harm? The question clarified my thinking in a way that hours of internal debate hadn't. My desire to help Jennifer wasn't motivated by guilt or a need for forgiveness. It was motivated by love for Tyler and Nathan, concern for someone who is in genuine medical danger, and the understanding that sometimes protecting people requires acting without their permission. I think there's a difference between manipulating someone to get what you want and intervening to protect them from consequences they can't fully understand or control. And in this case, what are the consequences Jennifer might not fully understand? That her children will blame themselves if she dies from a treatable condition because they couldn't convince her to accept help. That refusing treatment to avoid financial burden might feel principled to her, but it will traumatize Tyler and Nathan in ways that last for decades. The conversation helped me develop a framework for moving forward. I would find a way to ensure that Jennifer received the medical treatment she needed, but I would also create an opportunity for her to understand the full context of the assistance and make an informed decision about whether to accept it. The solution came through Nathan, who had grown into a thoughtful and articulate young man with his father's charm and a moral clarity that neither Marcus nor Jennifer possessed. Aunt Rebecca, Nathan said during one of our regular dinners, I want to talk to Mom about you. Really talk to her. Not about the past or about Dad's crimes, but about who you are now and what you've been doing with the foundation. Nathan, that could backfire badly. Your mother has spent years building walls against accepting anything from me. Trying to break those down might just make her more resistant. But she doesn't really know you anymore. She's been angry at the person you were 7 years ago, but she doesn't know the person that you've become. Maybe if she understood what you do now, if she saw how you help people like the victims of Dad's crimes, she might be able to see you differently.
The idea was risky, but it offered something that purely financial solutions couldn't provide, the possibility of genuine reconciliation based on understanding rather than just crisis management. Nathan arranged a family dinner at his apartment, telling Jennifer only that he wanted to spend time with both her and me, that he was tired of having family relationships fractured by old conflicts. He didn't mention her medical situation or the financial assistance she needed, focusing instead on his desire to have the important people in his life in the same room. Jennifer arrived reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with the prospect of spending an evening with me, but unwilling to disappoint Nathan by refusing. She looked tired and worried, the stress of her medical situation evident in the tension around her eyes and the careful way she moved, as if her body was fragile. I had prepared extensively for the conversation, but not with arguments or justifications for past decisions. Instead, I brought photo albums and newsletters from the foundation, documentation of the work I had been doing with fraud victims and the lives that had been rebuilt through our assistance programs. Jennifer, I said carefully after Nathan had served dinner, I know this is uncomfortable for both of us. I'm not here to relitigate the past or to ask for forgiveness. But Nathan asked me to help you understand what my life looks like now, and I thought you might be interested in hearing about the work I do with people who've been hurt by financial crimes. I opened the first photo album, showing pictures from foundation events, support group meetings, and financial literacy classes we offered to fraud victims. This is Mrs. Rodriguez, I said, pointing to a photo of an elderly woman speaking at a podium. She lost her entire retirement savings to an investment scam similar to Marcus's. When she came to us, she was facing eviction and hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks because she was too ashamed to tell her family what had happened. Jennifer looked at the photo with reluctant interest. We helped her apply for emergency assistance, connected her with legal aid to pursue recovery of some of her losses, and most importantly, helped her understand that being victimized by financial predators isn't a character flaw. She's now one of our volunteer counselors, helping other seniors avoid the kind of scam that hurt her. I continued through the albums, describing client after client who had rebuilt their lives after being devastated by crimes like Marcus's. People who had lost homes, retirement funds, children's college savings, and medical treatment money to sophisticated fraudsters who preyed on trust and hope. The work isn't really about the money, I explained. Most of the time, we can't recover what people have lost, but we can help them understand that they're not alone, that being victimized doesn't make them stupid or weak, and that it's possible to rebuild even after losing everything. Jennifer listened without speaking for nearly an hour, occasionally asking questions about specific cases or foundation programs. Her defensive hostility was gradually being replaced by something approaching curiosity. Finally, Nathan spoke up. Mom, Aunt Rebecca's foundation has helped more than 300 families over the past few years. People just like the ones Dad hurt. She spent every day since Dad went to prison trying to undo the kind of damage he caused. Jennifer looked at me directly for the first time since arriving. Why? She asked simply. The question was loaded with years of anger and confusion, but it was also genuine. She wanted to understand the motivation behind choices that had seemed inexplicable and cruel from her perspective. Because I understand what it feels like to have your family destroyed by financial crime, I said honestly. Because I know what it's like to watch people you love suffer consequences they don't deserve for choices they didn't make. Because helping other families heal from that kind of trauma helps me process my own guilt and grief about what happened to us. Do you think what you did was right, cooperating with the FBI against Marcus? The question I had been anticipating and dreading in equal measure. There was no answer that would satisfy her completely, but there was truth that might help her understand the motivation. I think it was necessary. I think Marcus's crimes would have continued and escalated if law enforcement hadn't intervened. I think more families would have been destroyed, more vulnerable people would have lost their life savings, and eventually the collapse would have been even more devastating for everyone involved, including Tyler and Nathan. I paused, choosing my words carefully. But I also think the way I handled it was imperfect.
I should have found better ways to warn you about what was coming. I should have been more sensitive to the impact on you and the boys. I was so focused on preventing future victims that I didn't adequately consider how to protect the victims Marcus had already created, including his own family. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. Do you have any idea what those years were like for us? Losing the house, moving in with my parents, watching Nathan and Tyler get teased at school because their father was in prison for stealing money? No, I said simply. I don't. I was dealing with my own guilt and isolation, but I wasn't dealing with the practical consequences of raising 2 children alone after having your entire life destroyed. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been. I hated you, she said quietly. For years, I hated you more than I hated Marcus. At least Marcus was weak and stupid. You were supposed to be family, and you chose to destroy us. I can understand that. I would probably have hated me too in your situation. The admission seemed to deflate some of the anger she had been carrying. Nathan reached across the table to take his mother's hand. Mom, I need to tell you something. Aunt Rebecca's foundation has helped more than 300 families over the past few years. People just like the ones Dad hurt. She spent every day since Dad went to prison trying to undo the kind of damage he caused. What you mean? Nathan looked at me apologetically before continuing. The hardship grant you got for your medical expenses, the one that paid for your cardiologist appointments, that came from Aunt Rebecca's foundation. She created a real program to help people like you, but she designed it specifically so you could get help without knowing it came from her.
The silence that followed was deafening. Jennifer stared at Nathan, then at me, processing the implications of what she had just learned. You've been helping me secretly? For how long? Just for the medical expenses, I said. Nathan told me you were having health problems but couldn't afford treatment. I couldn't let you suffer because of pride or because of conflicts between us. The surgery, she said suddenly, the cardiac surgery I need, the one I can't afford. Is that why we're having this conversation? I nodded. The surgery you need will cost more than the hardship grant program can cover, but I have the resources to pay for it, and I want to help if you'll let me. Jennifer stood up abruptly, pacing to the window of Nathan's apartment. So this whole evening, this reconciliation attempt, it's all about you trying to manipulate me into accepting charity? No, Nathan said firmly. This evening is about me being tired of having my family broken into pieces by pride and resentment, about me wanting my mother to understand that the person she's been hating for 7 years isn't the same person who's sitting at this table. Tyler, who had been quiet throughout most of the conversation, finally spoke up. Mom, Aunt Rebecca didn't have to tell you about the foundation or the hardship grant. She could have just paid for your surgery through another anonymous program and you would never have known. The fact that she's telling you the truth, giving you the choice to accept or refuse help, that's the opposite of manipulation. Jennifer turned back to face me, tears streaming down her face. Why would you want to help me? After all the horrible things I've said about you, after the way I've kept the boys from having a relationship with you, why would you care what happens to me? The answer was complex, involving years of therapy, personal growth, and hard-won wisdom about the nature of family and forgiveness, but it was also simple. Because Tyler and Nathan love you, because they would be devastated if something happened to you that could have been prevented, because you're a good mother who sacrificed everything to take care of your children after their father's crimes destroyed your life. And because helping people who are in impossible situations is what gives my life meaning now. Jennifer sat back down at the table, wiping her eyes with Nathan's napkin. If I accept your help, what does that mean? Do you expect forgiveness? Do you expect a relationship? Do you expect me to pretend that the past didn't happen? I don't expect anything, I said honestly. I hope that someday we can have a civil relationship for Tyler and Nathan's sake, but that has to develop naturally, if it develops at all. The help I'm offering doesn't come with conditions or expectations. It's just help, because you need it and I can provide it.
The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical details about the surgery, insurance coordination, and financial arrangements. Jennifer asked detailed questions about the foundation's work, about my motivations for leaving the prosecutor's office, and about my current relationship with Marcus. When we finally said goodbye, she hugged Nathan and Tyler, but offered me only a formal handshake and a quiet, "Thank you." It wasn't reconciliation, but it was acknowledgement, and that felt like progress. Jennifer's cardiac surgery took place 6 weeks later at one of Phoenix's premier heart hospitals. The procedure was complex but successful, correcting the congenital defect that had threatened her life and providing her with the prospect of many healthy years ahead. I paid the medical bills directly, working with the hospital's financial counselors to ensure that Jennifer's credit wasn't damaged and that her insurance company properly processed their portion of the expenses. The total cost was substantial, but it represented money well spent on preserving a family and preventing trauma that would have lasted for generations. Tyler and Nathan kept me updated on their mother's recovery, reporting that she was healing well and beginning to return to her normal activities. The relief of having the medical crisis resolved seemed to have lifted a weight from the entire family, allowing them to focus on rebuilding rather than just surviving. 3 months after the surgery, I received an unexpected phone call from Jennifer. "Rebecca, I hope I'm not bothering you, but I wanted to talk to you about something." "Of course. How are you feeling? Are you recovering well from the surgery?" "I'm feeling much better, thank you. The doctors say my heart function is completely normal now. But that's not why I'm calling." She paused, and I could hear her taking a deep breath. "I've been thinking about what you said about helping people who've been hurt by financial crimes, about the work your foundation does. And I've been thinking about my own situation, about how it felt to be victimized by someone you trusted, even when that someone was my own husband." "Jennifer, you don't have to. Please let me finish." I realized that in some ways I was as much a victim of Marcus's crimes as the investors were. I trusted him completely. I believed his explanations about where the money was coming from. I participated in a lifestyle funded by theft without knowing it was theft. Her voice was getting stronger, more determined. I also realized that when you cooperated with the FBI investigation, you weren't just protecting future victims, you were protecting me and the boys from becoming even more deeply complicit in Marcus's crimes. If his schemes had continued for another few years, if we'd continued accepting money and gifts that came from fraud, we might have faced criminal charges ourselves.
The insight surprised me. In all my years of therapy and self-reflection, I had never considered that my cooperation with the investigation might have protected Jennifer and the boys from legal consequences. I never thought about it that way, I admitted. "I have a proposal," Jennifer continued. "I want to volunteer with your foundation. I want to help other families who've been hurt by financial crimes, particularly spouses and children who didn't know their family's wealth came from illegal sources." The offer was unexpected and deeply moving. Jennifer's experience as both a victim and an unknowing beneficiary of financial crime gave her a unique perspective that could be invaluable in helping other families navigate similar trauma. "Are you sure you're ready for that kind of work? It can be emotionally challenging, especially given your personal connection to these issues." "I think I need to do it," she said. "I need to find a way to make something positive come out of the destruction Marcus caused. I need to help other people avoid the mistakes I made, the signs I missed, the warning signals I ignored because I wanted to believe everything was legitimate." 6 months later, Jennifer had become one of the foundation's most effective volunteer counselors. Her ability to connect with spouses and children of financial criminals, her understanding of the shame and confusion that accompanies the discovery that your life was built on crime, and her hard-won wisdom about rebuilding after losing everything made her uniquely qualified to help other families navigate similar crises. Working together at the foundation hadn't magically repaired our relationship, but it had created a context for healing that purely personal interactions might never have achieved. We were united by shared purpose rather than divided by painful history. And that shared purpose was gradually creating space for mutual respect and maybe, eventually, something approaching friendship.
The foundation's work had also created opportunities for Tyler and Nathan to contribute meaningfully to addressing the kind of harm their father had caused. Tyler's social work training made him effective at connecting with fraud victims who were dealing with depression and anxiety related to their financial losses. Nathan's accounting background helped clients understand complex financial documents and develop strategies for rebuilding their economic security. For the first time since Marcus's arrest, our family was working together rather than being torn apart by the consequences of his crimes. We weren't the family we had been before the crisis, and we might never fully heal from the trauma of that period. But we were becoming something new and potentially stronger. That strength would be tested sooner than any of us anticipated, in ways that would require everything we had learned about forgiveness, accountability, and the true meaning of family loyalty. Marcus was released from federal prison on a crisp October morning after serving 11 years of his 15-year sentence. Tyler and Nathan were waiting for him at the prison gates, two grown men now who barely resembled the confused children he had left behind. I watched from my car across the street, having driven 3 hours to witness this moment without intruding on their reunion. The man who emerged from the prison looked nothing like the arrogant fraudster who had been sentenced over a decade earlier. Marcus had aged, grayed, and developed the quiet dignity that sometimes comes from genuinely confronting your worst mistakes. He hugged his sons with tears streaming down his face, and I could see them talking intensely as they walked toward Tyler's car. My phone rang an hour later. It was Nathan. "Aunt Rebecca, Dad wants to see you. He knows you were there today." The meeting took place at a small coffee shop halfway between the prison and Phoenix. Marcus arrived looking nervous and uncertain, wearing clothes that Tyler had brought him and carrying a small bag containing everything he owned after 11 years of incarceration. "Rebecca," he said, sitting across from me at a corner table, "thank you for coming." We talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing, about his plans for rebuilding his life, about the job skills he had learned in prison, about his hopes for reconnecting with his children, but mostly we talked about accountability and forgiveness, about the difference between making amends and expecting absolution. I know I can never undo the damage I caused, to the victims, to our family, to you, but I want to spend whatever years I have left trying to make things right. 3 months later, Marcus was working as a financial literacy counselor for the foundation, helping former inmates understand money management and avoid the kind of desperation that leads to financial crime. His salary was modest, his apartment was small, but his work was meaningful in ways his previous success had never been. Jennifer's reaction to Marcus's release was complicated, but mature. They would never reconcile as a couple, but they developed a respectful co-parenting relationship, focused on supporting Tyler and Nathan's continued growth. She continued her volunteer work with the foundation, often collaborating with Marcus on programs for families affected by white-collar crime. My parents, now in their 80s, gradually began accepting that our family had evolved into something different, but not necessarily broken. They started attending foundation events, proud of the work their children were doing together, even if they couldn't fully understand how we had arrived at this point. The final reconciliation came during Tyler's wedding 2 years after Marcus's release. As I watched my nephew dance with his father and saw Nathan laughing with his mother, and observed Marcus and Jennifer working together to ensure their son's wedding was perfect, I realized that we had become something unprecedented. We weren't the family that had gathered around Easter dinner 12 years ago. That family was built on comfortable lies, unexamined privileges, and the assumption that love meant never holding each other accountable. This family was built on hard truths, earned respect, and the understanding that real love sometimes requires difficult choices. Standing at the edge of the dance floor, watching 3 generations of our family celebrate together, I felt something I hadn't experienced since that devastating Easter dinner: complete peace with the choices I had made. The advice they hadn't wanted to hear had ultimately saved them all, even if it had taken over a decade for that salvation to become apparent. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.